British Prime Minister Theresa May is addressing Parliament today with the latest on the investigation into last week's poisoning of a former Russian double agent and his daughter. They are both still in critical condition. May is expected to point blame at the Russian state, who continues to deny involvement. Let's listen in to what she has to say.
Together with experts from our armed forces, to sift and assess all the available evidence, to identify crime scenes and decontamination sites, and to follow every possible lead to find those responsible. That investigation continues, and we must allow the police to continue with their work. This morning I chaired a meeting of the National Security Council in which we considered the information so far available. As is normal, the Council was updated on the assessment and intelligence picture, as well as the state of the investigation. It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. Based on the positive identification of this chemical agent by world-leading experts at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down, our knowledge that Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so, Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, and our assessment that Russia views some defectors as legitimate targets for assassinations, the government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Mr. Speaker, there are therefore only two plausible explanations for what happened in Salisbury on the 4th of March. Either this was a direct act by the Russian state against our country, or the Russian government lost control of its potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get into the hands of others. This afternoon, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has summoned the Russian ambassador to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and asked him to explain which of these two possibilities it is, and therefore to account for how this Russian-produced nerve agent could have been deployed in Salisbury against Mr. Skripal and his daughter. My right honourable friend has stated to the ambassador that the Russian Federation must immediately provide full and complete disclosure of the Novichok programme to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and he has requested the Russian government's response by the end of tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, this action has happened against a backdrop of a well-established pattern of Russian state aggression. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea was the first time since the Second World War that one sovereign nation has forcibly taken territory from another in Europe. Russia has fomented conflict in the Donbass, repeatedly violated the national airspace of several European countries, and mounted a sustained campaign of cyber espionage and disruption. This has included meddling in elections and hacking the Danish Ministry of Defence and the Bundestag, among many others. During his recent State of the Union address, President Putin showed video graphics of missile launches, flight trajectories and explosions, including the modelling of attacks on the United States with a series of warheads impacting in Florida. While the extrajudicial killing of terrorists and dissidents outside Russia were given legal sanction by the Russian Parliament in 2006. And of course, Russia used radiological substances in its barbaric assault on Mr. Litvinenko. We saw promises to assist the investigation then, but they resulted in denial and obfuscation and the stifling of due process and the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, following Mr. Litvinenko's death, we expelled Russian diplomats, suspended security cooperation, broke off bilateral plans on visas, froze the assets of the suspects and put them on international extradition lists, and these measures remain in place. Furthermore, our commitment to collective defence and security through NATO remains as strong as ever in the face of Russian behaviour. Indeed, our armed forces have a leading role in NATO's enhanced forward presence, with British troops leading a multinational battle group in Estonia. We have led the way in securing tough sanctions against the Russian economy, and we have at all stages worked closely with our allies, and we will continue to do so. We must now stand ready to take much more extensive measures. Mr. Speaker, on Wednesday we will consider in detail the response from the Russian state. Should there be no credible response, we will conclude that this action amounts to an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And I will come back to this House and set out the full range of measures that we will take in response. Mr. Speaker, this attempted murder using a weapons-grade nerve agent in a British town was not just a crime against the Skripals. It was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk. And we will not tolerate such a brazen attempt to murder innocent civilians on our soil. I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister in advance for an advance copy of her statement on this deeply alarming attack that raises very serious questions. The whole House condemns the suspected
And we just heard the British PM Theresa May condemning the Russian state for a whole litany of crimes. Of course, this was all started by the poisoning with that nerve agent. We also right now have CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata. He joins me now from London. Charlie, I mean, those were pretty strong words from PM May there. I mean, she essentially said that this was an unlawful use of force against the UK. They will carefully consider the Russian state's response, but it's safe to say she's angry.
It's stronger than we expected, Tanya, and these are our takeaways. She pointed out specifically that there's evidence enough to support that the poison was a military-grade agent developed by Russia, one that Russia has previously used in the past and produced in the past, and it's highly likely that the Russians are responsible. Then she sets out that it can be one of two things. Either it was a direct act by the Russian state, or somehow somebody allowed this material to get in the hands of others. Then she essentially put the Russian Federation on notice, saying, look, by end of business tomorrow, we want to hear your explanation for why this has happened, whether it was state-controlled or whether it happened to slip into the hands of the wrong people because somebody allowed that to happen. She then referred to what she called a barbaric assault on Alexander Litvinenko and the things that were the measures that they put in place then, including expelling diplomats and freezing assets, saying that all of those threats remain on the table. So we have tomorrow to look forward to, where we find out what the Russian Federation's response is, if there is a response at all.
Right.
And then Wednesday to determine what the British government is willing to do according to what they hear.
What do you think the British government could be willing to do in this case? I mean, this definitely, in their mind, is an escalation.
It is an escalation. It certainly laid out the details more than we were expecting, to suggest that it was military-grade nerve agent, and not just suggesting, but blaming that the Russian government is capable and has produced it. It certainly points the finger of blame at the Russian government, at the Kremlin, and, of course, at Russian President Vladimir Putin. What can they do? They can expel diplomats, as they've done in the past. They can freeze assets that they've done in the past. The World Cup is coming up, and there has been talk of possibly boycotting that. That will not be popular in this country. She also suggested that, you know, the British military, flexing military muscles, saying that the military is involved with NATO in military operations in Estonia. And as you mentioned, put down this whole litany of offenses that Russia has been responsible for in the past few years, including Crimea and the Ukraine.
Yeah, there's a lot of anger there in the UK. It will be interesting to see how Russia responds. Charlie D'Agata, thank you for that.